Hello, I'm Randy Kearns. I'm a professor here at the University of New Orleans, and I'll be teaching Management 4450 and 5450 this semester. We'll primarily go over natural disaster as it relates to disaster management and disaster operations. But as we go through the semester, we'll hit specific types of disaster, and we'll talk about our roles in trying to manage and deal with response to a disaster, as well as personal preparedness and business continuity aspects. Our primary outcomes that we want to accomplish is just understanding the nature of disaster, and then again, as I mentioned, thinking about the business continuity aspects, and certainly from a personal preparedness standpoint. We'll talk about self-care and buddy care in terms of first aid later on, but the whole aim is to better prepare you as an individual and better put you in a position to be able to prepare your business and your operation to be able to respond to, deal with, and recover from a disaster. Key terms that we want to be sure and cover this semester include HVA, which is a hazards and vulnerability analysis, THIRA, which is a threat or hazard identification and risk assessment. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between the two. It's more nuanced than it is substantive. All hazards planning is an approach we take for all hazards. And then training and education, the role training and education plays in our disaster preparedness and disaster response. The difference between natural and technological disasters, we'll primarily focus on natural disasters this semester, and then the 4 phases of emergency management, which planning, response, recovery, and mitigation. There's certain aspects that we'll talk about prevention, but primarily we'll stick with 4 stages of emergency preparedness. Just understand the nature of disaster, what causes different types of disasters, what are ways that we can prevent either our exposure or our vulnerability to the disaster, preserving our operation, primarily not just the financial health, but also protecting our employees and protecting our facility. And then from a personal preparedness standpoint, trying to make good decisions to avoid putting ourselves in harm's way. And if you wind up in a difficult situation, what's the immediate steps you need to take to either rescue yourself or rescue someone else. In most texts, you'll see 4 stages of disaster preparedness or emergency response, and that's planning or preparation, the response phase, the recovery phase, and the mitigation phase. Let's primarily talk about each of these just a moment. Before any type of disaster, we'll do something called a hazard identification and vulnerabilities assessment. We identify the hazards that pose the greatest risk to our organization. And then we plan and prepare for those hazards that pose the greatest risk to our organization. If an event occurs, response occurs from the moment the disaster happens until we finish rescuing that last person or that last patient. The recovery phase really begins once response ends. And recovery can be really 2 phases, a short-term recovery and long-term recovery. Short-term recovery is really about just getting access to your building, getting the roads back open, getting the power back on. Long-term recovery includes rebuilding a facility, hardening a facility, and making it better prepared for the next type of event that may occur like that. And then mitigation is really something that happens all of the time. Mitigation is really looking at different ways we can either avoid a disaster by ways that we plan and prepare for it, ways that we can harden our structure, ways that we can become more resilient. But mitigation strategies are always important strategies to minimize the impact of a disaster. Now, there's 2 other aspects of this that do appear in the literature, depending on the angle that you take in studying disaster science. One is prevention, and prevention is really a step before planning and preparedness, and it's looking for ways to prevent certain types of, certainly technological disasters from occurring. And then anytime an event occurs, just understand that's that trigger point. So many times we focus on the response, but quite honestly, the response is really the shortest window of a disaster. The largest two windows are the planning phase before an event occurs and the recovery phase after an event occurs. And again, we break up recovery into two stages, a short term and a long term. Short term is really just about regaining access to our facilities and getting the lights back on, so to speak. And then that long-term recovery is, again, just identifying what are ways that we can become more resilient to what has occurred. There are really two different processes. In the business world and in the healthcare world, we're more likely to do something called an HVA. It's a hazards and vulnerability analysis. If you work in government service, you may be more likely to use something called a THIRA, which is threat and hazard identification and risk assessment. As you can tell by the terminology, they're basically the same thing, but let's talk just a little bit more about them here in just a minute. We always start with a hazard analysis, and the reason we start with a hazard analysis, it's something we can't control. You know, I can't control a hurricane or a tornado, but disaster history is really important. What's happened in the past has a great degree of predictability of what can occur in the future. And the more we know about our environment, the epidemiological impact, the meteorological impact, soil composition, there are other aspects of this. But understanding what types of hazards may impact our organization, our business, our homes, is really one of the most important things we can do, because we can't control our hazards, but we can control our vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are things that are within our control. Again, we can't control flooding to any significant degree, but we can control where our building lies in the floodplain. Understanding the floodplain, is your house below sea level or is it above sea level? Do we mitigate against that by elevating the structure? What are ways that we can prepare ourselves for certain types of hazards? Again, we can't control the hazards. We can control our vulnerabilities to the hazards. The more we can do a technological evaluation, understanding land use and building standards, the better it is for us to be able to manage our vulnerability to certain types of disaster. About 20 years ago now, we really took an approach called the all hazards approach. And the whole point to an all hazards approach is this. You know, in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, our focus really in the disaster world was more on terrorism, and then aspects of terrorism, bioterrorism, chemical threats. But the reality of the disasters we were dealing with in 2004, we had 4 different hurricanes that struck the state of Florida. 2005 was Hurricane Katrina. And so really by 2006, 2007, we really began to rewrite laws and rewrite structures that we use in the disaster planning world to be sure that we take an all hazards approach, because there are some commonalities in planning and preparation for any type of disaster that really cuts across whatever the disaster may be. Standpoint, we look at several things: frequency, how often has it occurred? What type of lessons did we learn from the last time this happened? Sometimes we talk about lessons lost. There are things that sometimes we don't learn well from our history, or sometimes we take the attitude of that'll never happen again. Data quality, what type of information do we have available? Is it small amounts? Is it manageable? And then scalability, what type of lessons have we learned, and can we scale them up into a larger type of solution? You know, again, from an academic standpoint, one of the easiest things we can do is set up and run a model. That's probably one of the least costly ways we can look at disaster analysis, is through modeling. There are a lot of other ways that we can plan for disaster. We can have different types of, we can have something called a tabletop exercise, and we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about the different ways that we can plan for a disaster later, but they include things like a tabletop exercise, a functional exercise, or a full-scale exercise. All of those things, though, are costly and consume a lot of manpower. Early on, one of the ways that in our world, in the academic world, that we can help is again creating mathematical models. If we understand the theoretical inputs, it's a lot easier for us to develop predictive models of what the outcomes may be. I'm going to use just a couple of examples without getting into a lot of detail about any one of these particular hazards, but just as examples in a way to, again, help add an image to what we're talking about and what we'll be talking about this semester. I'll start with Hurricane Katrina, and the reason I use Hurricane Katrina, many of you who live here in New Orleans and particularly lived in New Orleans at the time of Hurricane Katrina, you had a really personal, really unique experience. I did not live in New Orleans at the time. I had a substantial involvement in response to Hurricane Katrina, but my response was over in Waveland, Mississippi. It really had nothing to do with New Orleans. In fact, I did not come to New Orleans, at least during the first 2 months of the disaster response. But it's important for us to think about Hurricane Camille informed the people of Mississippi how terrible a disaster could be. And so what they did when they were building the hospital in Bay St. Louis, and if you don't know where Bay St. Louis is, it's a town just as you cross the state line into Mississippi, you're entering a county called Hancock County. The hospital for Hancock County is in a town down close to the ocean called Bay St. Louis. That hospital was built on what was considered the highest ground that was not flooded during Hurricane Camille. At the time, Hurricane Camille was considered one of the worst hurricanes of the 21st century. Of the 20th century. And so as they looked at what they were going to do, when they built their new hospital in 1985, I believe it was, they built it on what they saw as the highest ground. And that's what I've shown here on their map. And so these are pictures taken inside of the hospital as the storm approached. They did begin to move most of their patients out of their hospital, but there were a handful of patients that did remain there in the hospital as well as staff to take care of patients during the disaster. As the flooding took place, there's something called storm surge. We'll talk a lot more about storm surge later on when we talk about both hurricanes and flooding, just to understand that the storm surge completely flooded and inundated that area to the point that, as you can tell, we've got flooding now just outside of the building, and the what really is water from the ocean is now visible through the first floor windows of the hospital. And this is what it looked like again Monday morning, August the 29th, I believe it was, of 2005. If you look at the water against the outside of the building at this point, they've completely evacuated the first floor. They've moved all of the patients and all of the staff up to the second floor, but they've lost containment of the flooding that was going on there in the hospital. And that's what it looked like later on that morning. The reason that I show this picture is that particular building, in addition to missing the roof, and you can see the top of an SUV that was in the parking lot, that was their generator building. Obviously, they're not able to provide generator power or backup emergency power to the hospital at this particular point. This is just one of the patient rooms. If you'll notice the watermark in the room, just showing you how bad the water was at that particular point. This is what the medical records area looked like at that particular point. And this is actually me along with the hospital CEO and several representatives of both the Air Force and the Army and a couple of something called disaster medical assistance teams. We set up and operated a field hospital there in Waveland, Mississippi, and I was the hospital administrator of that particular mobile hospital for on and off for about 2 months. And that was the field hospital that we operated there in Waveland, Mississippi. But again, my experience of Hurricane Katrina and anyone who lived here in New Orleans was substantially different, just simply because, again, we saw a different angle of the disaster than you all did here, those of you who lived here at that time, just simply because of the overwhelming flooding that took place here. And so really the takeaway conclusion from Hurricane Katrina was to evacuate. And actually, about a month and a half later, Hurricane Rita occurred. This is just an example of a nursing home that evacuated a number of their residents. They put them on buses to evacuate them. And one of the buses caught fire and killed, I think, 22 or 23 people from that particular nursing home. You know, and what that reminds us is it's not just about the thought of evacuating, it's also about how do we keep people safe whenever we carry out an evacuation. There's a number of things that occurred that were mistakes that were made or things that we can learn from in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita. And so, you know, again, the main point that I do want to make here is disasters will occur. That's in our history, that will be in our future. It's how we respond to them and how we prepare for them that really put us in a position of being resilient, not just for the present, but for the future. I do want to point out that there was a particular lawsuit involving that particular bus, and the family settled for $80 million. You know, the main point that I'm making here is there's a cost associated with preparing for disaster, but there's a much bigger cost associated with either not preparing or planning or poorly planning for that disaster. I do want to mention earthquakes just a minute, not so much because that's a clear and present danger here in the New Orleans area, but if you do wind up relocating to another part of the country, particularly the West Coast, there's certainly a greater risk there associated with earthquakes. This is just an example that I like to use, the San Fernando earthquake in 1971. There's two different measures that we use in earthquakes. Again, we'll have an entire week dedicated to understanding more about earthquakes, but moment magnitude and intensity, moment magnitude has historically been referred to somewhat as the Richter scale, and then intensity gives us an idea of the degree of damage. The intensity can be anywhere from a Roman numeral 1 to a Roman numeral 12. The higher the intensity, obviously, the more profound the damage can be. It does give us a measure of how significant the damage is in certain parts, in certain areas, and it gives us what's typically a better idea of how much damage has occurred than the magnitude. There are some other measures where the epicenter is and the hypocenter. Again, we'll talk about that when we get into earthquakes. And the magnitude does certainly have a bearing on the amount of damage that we may see, but it's not as profound as some other things that we'll talk about. And this is just one particular example. I want to show you a couple of hospitals in the aftermath of the San Fernando earthquake. So this is the VA hospital. As we look at this particular building, at first glance, it doesn't look that bad. Just to understand that what you're looking at there should be 3 different wings of a building the wing in the middle has completely collapsed and claimed 49 lives in that collapse. And actually, if you look closer at the parking lot, you'll see a lot of the vehicles are red. Those are fire trucks that are in the parking lot that's a part of the rescue. This was another hospital. This was Olive View Hospital. It actually had just opened about 45 days before the earthquake. It was tagged as an earthquake-proof hospital. This particular hospital was immediately in the impact area of the earthquake, and does give you an idea of how much more resilient a building can be. But just understand, earthquake resistant and earthquake proof are really two different things. This also validated the fact that our engineering that we thought was vastly improved in the 1970s when this building was built still had quite a ways to go. One of the things, again, if we look at the building, if you think about the previous slide, it doesn't look that bad. As we look through some of the images, though, more up closely, we can see just how profound the damage is. This is one of the stairwells that completely separated from the building and collapsed. But again, it just gives you an idea of the magnitude of the earthquake. Just another one, I'll show you just a couple of slides from the Northridge earthquake. Killed 57, injured 8,700. This occurred very close to Los Angeles. The only reason this caused far less damage and far less fatalities, far fewer fatalities than it could have, was this particular earthquake occurred at 5 o'clock in the morning, long before there were a lot of people on the highway, long before a lot of people had gone into work. And so we believe that far fewer people were killed and far fewer people were injured. As profound as the earthquake was, it could have been vastly more impactful than it was. This just gives you an idea of looking at 8 particular hospitals in that area that ultimately had to be evacuated in the aftermath of the earthquake. The real challenge with that is, whenever we have a disaster, we look at hospitals as an example as one of those places that we see that as a safe space, a place we can go if we're injured and we need to be evacuated to a hospital. Just understand that when you need to go to the hospital, and the hospital either can't take care of you because their structure has been damaged, or you can't get to the hospital because the highway has been damaged, that becomes a profound problem. And so when we talk about earthquakes and the threat from earthquakes, those are two of the areas that we're greatly concerned with, is the type of damage they can cause to infrastructure. If it distorts the door of the fire station and the engine can't leave the building, it becomes very difficult for the firefighters to be able to do the job they need to do. And so, again, when we think about the impact to infrastructure, we also think about the impact to people and what that means in terms of our ability to take care of patients. This is an example of a hospital being struck by a tornado. Again, I like to use hospitals just simply because they're some of the most hardened structures that we'll deal with, and yet we've seen more than a few of them either damaged significantly or destroyed in the aftermath of certain types of disasters. This was in Joplin, Missouri, 2011, St. John's Regional. Fortunately, there were 2 large hospitals there in the Joplin area. If we look specifically at the hospital, as you look at this, it's kind of difficult to know exactly what you're looking at. Just to understand the white that you see through the window is the sky on the other side of the building. That's looking through the building now. It does give you an idea of just how much damage occurred and how much impact occurred to that particular hospital. This is an aerial view before and after the impact by the tornado. We won't talk as much about active shooter this semester. I think we do have one week that we'll devote to this. Just understand, although this is more of a what we would consider a technological disaster than we see it being a natural disaster, it is a clear and present danger that we live with in our society today. This is just one particular example that I like to use. Occurred a couple of years ago in Dayton, Ohio. Um, Again, just reminds you of how fortunate, unfortunate, how fortunate people were in the fact that officers were in the immediate area, but how unfortunate and how deadly these situations can become. Um, a person had staked out an area that he wanted to perpetrate this type of event. Began firing. He fired a total of 41 rounds, killed 9 people, injured 37. Um, Police were in the immediate area, heard the gunfire, and engaged the subject within 20 seconds of hearing the first shot. And they neutralized the shooter within 30 seconds of engaging the subject. So within a minute of the first shot being fired, the person doing the shooting had been taken down. But in that period of less than a minute, 9 people were killed and 37 injured. And if he fired only 41 shots and a total of 46 people were injured, it does give you an idea of the velocity and the capacity of one of the rounds coming from an AR style weapon. We'll talk a little bit more about different types of weapons and what type of damage or injury that they can produce later on. I do want to briefly talk about flash floods. Again, we'll have a week devoted to flooding just simply because it is a clear and present danger that we face in the New Orleans area. It is really the most common hazard that we'll deal with. Some develop slowly, some occur much more quickly. It really depends on several things. Actually, so frequent flooding in New Orleans occurs for several reasons. Number one, we have a lot of impervious surfaces. We have a lot of places that water has to run off. It can't really be absorbed into the soil. We have a clay subsoil. The water table is really close to the surface. About half of the city, and again, when we get into the flooding presentation, but about half of what we know today as Orleans Parish was land that was originally swampland that was drained and reclaimed as land. Now, a part of making the city safe to protect it from malaria and yellow fever during the 19th century was draining the swamp. You kill the habitat of what literally was billions of mosquitoes, and you reduce the fact that in certain years in the 19th century we had thousands of people that died of yellow fever or of malaria, and so the clear and present danger was mosquitoes each year. And so one of the solutions was to drain the swamp, kill their habitat. If you can destroy the habitat, you would substantially reduce the vector, the number of mosquitoes causing that type of death. But the challenge with that then is the best way to think about that is if you suck water out of a sponge, what happens to the sponge? It contracts, it gets much smaller. Just understand that if the swampland is starting out at or just above or just below sea level, and you take the water out of it, it's going to contract, and in some places contract in a pretty dramatic way. That's why as much as about 50% of the city lies below sea level, and in some cases 10, 12, 15 feet below sea level. And so we've created this levee system to surround the city, and that works reasonably well of keeping water from coming into the city, but it creates kind of a bowl, so to speak. And again, something we'll talk about later in the flooding section. But for that to work, we've got to be able to effectively be able to pump the water out of that bowl. And anyway, that can be a challenge in and of itself. And this is kind of a cross section giving you an idea of just understand the height of the Mississippi River at normal level and the height of Lake Pontchartrain at a normal level. The Mississippi is higher than Lake Pontchartrain. Lake Pontchartrain is closer to being the level of the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean. And so, the Mississippi is flowing downhill, but it does give you an idea of what the height of the river is, the height of Lake Pontchartrain, and then different areas within. This is kind of a cross section looking at it, again giving you an idea of what the bowl, so to speak, looks like. We'll talk again more about this when we talk about flooding and we talk about the threat of, posed by flooding in the New Orleans area. Probably one other way to think about this is New Orleans is for all practical purposes an island. The only way to get into New Orleans is to cross a bridge, and that bridge crosses a body of water. There are 32 lanes of traffic, 16 that go into the city and 16 that come out of the city. So if we entered something called contraflow, where we turn all of the lanes in a way that everybody can leave the city, we still only have 32 routes, 32 roads that we can travel on to evacuate the city. So it's I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's incredibly difficult to evacuate the city. And so we're left with the dilemma of how do we protect the city? And it gets back to the levee system and the pump system, things that we'll talk about again when we talk more specifically about flooding. Pandemic. Again, we've got a week dedicated to the pandemic also, but Joshua Lederberg earned a Nobel laureate in physiology and medicine in 1958. He has what's a really prominent quote: "The single biggest threat to man's continued dominance of the planet is the virus." There are 4 vectors, pathological vectors that can make us sick. Pathogens that can make us sick. And that includes a virus, a bacteria, a fungus, and a parasite. Parasites and fungi typically don't create the type of threats that we see with bacteria and with viruses. And with bacteria, we have a number of different types of antibiotics to be able to take care of patients with a bacterial infection. So we're not as concerned about bacterial infections. Viruses are a different story, a completely different story. And again, as we think about viruses, it's important to remember what we just dealt with the COVID pandemic. 7 million have been killed in the COVID pandemic, and that number is still rising. The substantial difference, though, between this pandemic and the 1918 influenza pandemic was the most we could do in 1918 was supportive care. There were a number of things we tried to do, but we really didn't have the same types of systems in place, the same type of equipment, the same types of processes to be able to care for patients in the same way that we did in 2020 and 2021 and we do today. We also were able to rapidly develop a reasonably effective vaccine that for the most part has substantially minimized the impact of the COVID pandemic. But we will talk about pandemics and infectious disease later on. Just understand that historically, a pandemic event, the Black Death or the Black Plague, pretty much decimated Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed about 60% of the entire population of Europe. And actually, if we go back to about 1329, you began to see the deaths, the death rates. There were tens of thousands, probably as much as more than 1 million people who were killed along the Silk Road. And the Black Death was a bacterial disease that was transmitted We saw cases in Mongolia, China, India, and again, what the trading route commonly referred to as the Silk Road. And then as the transmission of the disease moved into Europe, it wiped out more than half of the population there. And although Ebola never reached what we would call a pandemic, just understand that Ebola is one of those viruses that's incredibly frightening. It creates the types of symptoms and the types of conditions that we see in patients that, we had less than 10 patients with Ebola in America, and in 2014, 2015, and there was a lot of substantial concern about what we were going to deal with Ebola. Now, it's never moved into any type of a rapid spread, but there are certainly reasons that we have an ongoing concern about viral hemorrhagic fever, such as Ebola, also another one called Marburg. But again, something we'll talk about later on when we talk about pandemics and infectious disease. And then just the definition of a pandemic. This is from a chapter in a textbook that I wrote a couple of years ago, but pandemics are unpredictable. When we talk about the word pandemic, we're talking about something that is generally worldwide. It's new, novel. Our body's autoimmune system has not seen something quite like this, and thus been able to build antibodies, some type of an autoimmune response to it. It's easily spread from person to person. Most of the population is susceptible because, again, we've not been exposed to it. Three conditions really need to exist, and again, so I wrote this in a textbook, 2012. Just understand, in 2012, we really thought the next pandemic was going to be an influenza pandemic. And so the examples I used dealt with influenza. Whether it was a coronavirus or an influenza virus, it was a virus, and just understand that it's typically a new and novel virus. It must infect humans, it must be easily spread, and it must be unique in the fact that we're vulnerable to it and our bodies have not built an autoimmune response to being exposed to that particular type of virus. Okay, so the last thing I want to use is the threat of fire, and the reason I like to use the threat of fire as a good example in disaster planning and disaster preparedness. If I decide tomorrow I do not want to deal with a hurricane again in my life, and I decide to move to St. Louis. Well, in St. Louis, I may be exposed to tornadoes, or I may be exposed to flooding. And I may decide I don't want to be exposed to tornadoes, and I don't want to be exposed to flooding, so I move to Los Angeles. Well, and then the first earthquake reminds me that that may not be what I want to deal with either. Just understand that there are certain types of disasters that are more that have a greater likelihood of occurrence in that particular part of the country than others. The threat of fire is a clear and present danger to every business and every home in every part of the United States. And so we like to use the threat of fire and burn injuries as a good example of a threat that we all need to prepare for, and we all need to be able to know what are some of the initial things we can do to deal with it. I like to use burn injury as a research, as an aim in research, primarily because it is a time-sensitive injury. The population that's affected by burn injuries is really a small patient population, but it's pretty easy to manage and measure. The data quality, it's easy to troubleshoot. There's a lot of scalability that we can learn from this. And then there's also a limited supply of critical facilities. Nationally, there's 138 burn centers. There's 5,500 total hospitals, and roughly about one out of every 50 hospitals has a burn center. So if you have a burn injury and you need to be admitted to a burn center, There's limited numbers of hospitals and limited numbers of beds that can take care of those patients. You know, we use general supply and demand metrics in the hospital world, just as we do a lot of other things. If there was a demand for 5,000 beds, we'd have a supply for 5,000 beds, so long as there was, you know, financial support to be able to pay for the care of those 5,000 beds. Just understand that there's a need on a day-to-day basis for about 2,000 beds, and so there's a supply of about 2,000 beds. And what that really means is during a disaster, if we can envision scenarios that may produce substantially more patients than that, we do have to think in terms of disaster planning and preparedness. How would we scale up to that? How would we manage the surge of those patients? And I think about that from a healthcare and a disaster planning standpoint. My whole point to you is to think in terms of how any of these types of disasters would impact you personally or would impact your business. And then how do you plan for it, and how do you respond to it, and hopefully recover from it so that your business continues to prosper, your home is safe, and your family is safe. When I think about burn centers, there are 4 burn centers in Louisiana. Of the 4 burn centers, only one is co-located with a level 1 trauma center. It is identified as a verified burn center, and that's here at University Medical Center in New Orleans. Surge capacity, when we talk about surge capacity, we talk about our ability to absorb additional patients, and we primarily look at 3 metrics: how much staff we have, how much space we have to be able to bring them in, and then supplies or stuff. And then the point that we meet is something called surge equilibrium. What I mean by that is the number of patients coming in and the number of patients going out and the number of people that can care for the patients create this balance. You know, equilibrium, if you think back to your econ class, that point of equilibrium is where that sweet spot where supply and demand cross. The demand curve, the supply curve, where that crosses, that's equilibrium. And that's really what we're looking for in surge capacity as well, where we reach that point of where we provided enough people, enough supplies, enough space to take care of the patients that are still continuing to need care. And the best way to think about the threat of fire, this is a case study from the Station nightclub fire that occurred in Rhode Island. This is kind of a layout of the Station nightclub fire. And the main reason I use this is it gives you an idea of just how quickly things can move from bad to terrible in a short period of time, and why the threat of fire is an omnipresent threat that is, again, a clear and present danger to our homes and our businesses. In this particular case, the National Institutes of Safety and Technology did a recreation of the fire. And so this is the stage of where a music group called Great White, previously had been known as Whitesnake, but where they were performing. They decided that they were going to use fireworks in their performance, and they had historically used fireworks, but they'd used indoor fireworks. In this particular case, they couldn't find indoor fireworks, so somebody decided it would be okay to use outdoor fireworks. That didn't work real well. At the 10-second mark, it ignited 2 different areas around the stage and began to burn. At the 20-second mark, this is what the burning approximately looked like. At the 30-second mark, this is what it looks like. At the 40-second mark, the 50-second mark, and at the 60-second mark. And just the best way to think about this is there were over 300 people in this somewhat confined space. As we would put it in another area where I've worked before, a number of the patrons would be what we would consider our over-beveraged guest. And so again, the lighting is low. There's this fire that breaks out. You don't really notice it to begin with. There's 350 people in this small space, and this is 1 minute in. If you've not made your way to the exit by now, chances are you're not going to have a good outcome. This is at 70 seconds. And this is at 80 seconds, and then this is with thermal imaging of what the folks in the fire service would call a flashover or a flash or a backdraft. And so as the flashover occurs, we see the temperatures dramatically soar. And when we're talking about 100 degrees Celsius, just understand 100 degrees Celsius is 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And if we look at some of these areas closer to 1,000 degrees Celsius, I think you have a pretty good idea of what type of temperatures we have. We have basically a non-survivable area now where the stage and the dance area is located. And just understand, if you think about any nightclub that you've attended, generally speaking, these buildings aren't built so that you can rapidly decompress them so that they can rapidly evacuate the building. And so there were only a handful of exits. One of the exits was almost immediately blocked by the fire. Again, it was very difficult for people to get out. It produced, I think it produced a total of 97 deaths and a number of 147 injuries. And this gives you an idea of where people died trying to get out of the building, at least where bodies were recovered. So let's kind of wrap up with just a couple of things. So with any disaster, the whole point is we want to plan for known hazards. The planning process is really about hazard identification. We can't control our hazards. We can't control hurricanes. We can't control tornadoes. We can mitigate against the threat of fire, but fires do occur. And so a part of the planning process is understanding the true hazards that we face. And then what type of resources do we have? And then gap analysis. The gap analysis is what's the gap between what we have and what we need for the situation we may be facing. Response, how do we respond to these things? And then recovery, short-term and long-term. You know, if it's you individually, how do you recover from it in a way that allows you to continue your life? Your family the same way, your home the same way, your business the same way. What are steps that you can take from your business standpoint to support your employees so that they can come back to work, to reestablish your supply chain so that you have the products that you need to be able to sell what you're trying to sell? You know, solutions are really about, again, just identifying the hazards that the threats that are there, and then what are our vulnerabilities to those hazards. Again, common goals. We want to restore order. We want to think about environmental concerns, infrastructure stability. You know, how safe is it for us to be able to move from one particular part of the area to another? If you're in the response mode, our responder to victim ratio is important. You know, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the federal response was really poor. One of the things that we did, I was a reservist with FEMA at that time. In 2004, the reason things went really well in Florida was we sent all the King's horses and all the King's men. We had at one particular point thousands of responders from the state of Florida and thousands of federal responders. We, for a lot of reasons, didn't manage to be able to do that, at least in the early days and the early weeks of Hurricane Katrina. And it cost a lot of people their lives, their livelihoods. And so, you know, there's this responder to victim ratio. The more you can bring people in, or the more people you can get out, the more you can create that balance. And the sooner you can create that balance, the easier it's going to be for you to be able to help somebody. If you're trying to help 10, 20, 30, 40 people, when that ratio is really high, it's really difficult to be able to do that. And you also want to be able to think about it from a business standpoint. How do you help your employees How do you help your family? Are there other people that can help you do these things? And then finance is one of the most important things. How do we assure minimal interruption of the business that we have? How do we assure minimal interruption of our lives? And then what type of cash do you have on hand? Just understand that in the loss of electricity, it's very difficult to have credit card transactions. And so, as you saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida, having cash would be an important thing to have, and not needing to go out very often, at least in the early days of the disaster. Our conclusions are this: relationships are essential. Who can help you? Who you call? Who's going to be able to provide you support? From a business standpoint, your supply chain. What you need to be able to get your business up and running. From your home, what are the things that you need? What type of preparation have you made already? Do you have water on hand? Do you have food? Do you have the things that you need to be able to, and are you in a safe place? You can have all of those things, but if your home is sitting, 5 foot below sea level or 10 foot below sea level, and we lose flood control within the city, gravity always wins. The water always finds its way to the lowest points. And so, again, think about what those solutions are. Just understand all disasters are local. The state folks and the federal folks will do all they can to come in and help, but it really starts with you and it really ends with you. At some point, they're all going to go home, and it's yours to deal with. So what have you done to prepare for it? And that's where I get to education is such a game changer. The more you can prepare yourself for these types of events, the better off you're going to be, and the better off you're going to be able to quickly recover from whatever has occurred. With that, I'll say thank you, and I look forward to working with you this semester. And certainly, if you have questions, please feel free to send me an email or give me a call or come by and see me in the office. Thank you very much.